For my project on the relationship between solar exposure and temperature, I chose to explore the impact that distance from the equator has on the relationship between solar exposure and temperature. The data that will be used to investigate this topic comes from 6 different locations, all equidistant from each other, with the data being sourced monthly for 5 years between 2014 and 2018. These locations are found across the east side of Australia across 4 different states. These locations include Woolnorth, Tasmania, St Kilda in Victoria, Carrithul in New South Wales, Nymagee in New South Wales, Hungerford in Queensland, and Addervale in Queensland. It is important to remember that datasets may have fluctuations due to possible floods, droughts, or any other natural events that may alter the solar exposure or temperature during a time period of a location. The comparison of each location's 5-number summaries, mean, standard deviation, scatterplots, R and R squared, values, lines of best fit, and gradients will allow us to determine whether or not the distance from the equator has an impact on the relationship between solar exposure and temperature. As we can see when we compare the 5-number summaries of the 6 locations for temperature, there is a large variation between the maximum and minimums and averages of the temperature between the most northern and most southern locations, which is Addervale and Woolnorth. With Addervale having an average temperature of 29.83 degrees Celsius and Woolnorth having an average temperature of 16.105 degrees Celsius, this shows that there is a large drop in average temperatures, which as a whole shows that as we go further south from the equator, the temperatures will drop. Now we see the 5-number summaries of the 6 locations but for solar exposure. These tables show very similar traits to the temperature, as Addervale had an average solar exposure of 29.83 in comparison to Woolworth's 16.105. So as further we go south from the equator, the lower the solar exposure will be. This shows that the distance from the equator has an impact on temperature and solar exposure individually, as well as showing the relationship between solar exposure and temperature, but it does not show if the distance from the equator had any impact on the relationship between the 2 variables. The scatter plots here are used to portray the relationship between solar exposure and temperature. Now that we move on to the scatter plots, we can see that both the scatter plots, R and R squared values, the line of best fit, and the gradient all show that there is a strong to very strong positive correlation between the solar exposure and temperature in all of the data sets, with the exclusion of Woolnorth, which could have had one of these droughts, floods, or other natural incidents that could have altered the relationship. As we can see here, excluding Woolnorth's 0.71, the 5 other locations' R values are all placed between 0.88 and 0.91, which shows us how similar the values are and how strong the correlation is between the solar exposure and temperature of the location. With very similar R values on all scatter plots, this shows that regardless of the distance from the equator, the relationship between solar exposure and temperature stays the same. So ultimately, the question of whether or not distance from the equator has an impact on the relationship between solar exposure and temperature can be answered as no. Although having an impact on the variables independently, distance from the equator has no impact on the relationship.